I'm Art Farner. On June 2nd, it was my privilege to meet a young lady that's very much talked about nowadays. That young lady is Angela Davis. Today, I'd like for you to meet Angela Davis.
Before we do, however, I'd like to say her views and positions on various issues and problems in our society are considered by many to be very controversial, while to others, they're considered to be totally radical.
People in this country often tend to do is that they cannot understand how people can be totally committed to bringing about a change in this country, totally committed to eradicating the oppression and exploitation to which we as black people have been subjected to for so many hundreds of years. And they think that the person must really be something more than that, something different, and that the struggle the person is involved in, political beliefs, political activities, and so forth, that must be some kind of a facade. But see, I can't separate myself as a human being, as a woman, from my commitment to overthrowing all of the conditions in this country, destroying those conditions which have it that black children continue to die from starvation.
Mm-hmm. When you speak of overthrowing those conditions, I think this is what frightens people so much, you know. The average American, when you just simply say the word overthrow, he sees this as something very, very bad to him. I know you're not responsible for his feelings. But when you say these things, are you threatening someone or what?
We're threatening the oppressors with the power of the people. I see one of the things that people in this country forget about white people is that they founded this country on overthrowing their oppressor. You know, they made a revolution. And they forget completely what that revolution meant. And they forget that we are carrying on a struggle which they began. You see, they forget that it was Abraham Lincoln who said that whenever the institutions in a country do not satisfy the people, don't respond to the needs and the desires of the people, then the people must exercise either their constitutional right to amend that government and those institutions, or their revolutionary right to overthrow it. They forget that they have themselves revolutionary ancestors, and we have to begin to show them more and more that we are going to carry on that tradition. We're going to push it up to a higher level where we can really then begin to talk about building a society in which all people can be free.
Mm-hmm. You know, when I heard your speech, one of the things that you said that we must reevaluate our history. Were you speaking about the American history, the black history, or what?
I was talking about black history.
Black history.
Because one of the ways in which the oppressor in this country has tried to stifle our revolutionary potential is to convince us that in the past we have accepted our oppression, to try to convince us that we accepted slavery, that we accepted poverty, that we accepted starvation. And therefore, practically all indications that there was constant rebellion, constant resistance, constant refusal, that has been wiped out of our history. And so I think we have to look back towards our revolutionary ancestors. We have to learn from Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Harriet Tubman and all of the other black people whom we don't know about now because there were no records kept. We have to begin to talk about looking to them for leadership so that we can carry our struggle to another level and finally destroy this monster who's oppressing us.
You know, you mentioned genocide and birth control. And the mismanagement, more or less, of our children being fostered off onto other people. What are we talking about here in terms of blackness?
I see, you know, there are a whole lot of people talking about ecology, talking about population control, talking about air pollution, and they are trying to divert the people from the real root of all those problems. You know, I agree there is a problem of overpopulation, but why? Because the wealth of the world has been stolen and placed into the hands of a minority of the people, and therefore the majority of the people are the ones who have to bear the brunt of oppression. And so we don't talk about dealing with the problem of, quote, overpopulation by trying to convince people that they should take birth control pills or have themselves sterilized. We say that we have to snatch back what was stolen from us. And then that is the way in which we're going to solve the problem of overpopulation. One of the things that I heard when I was in Cuba last summer, when they were asked about their attitude towards birth control, you know, they said that you know, we don't deal with the problem of imperialism in that way. We deal with it by attacking the real enemy, by attacking the real problem, and that's what we have to do.
I wonder if I might ask you about some of your experiences in Cuba. You know, we hear a lot of rhetoric about Cuba and the lack of surviving people in Cuba. Are the people there surviving?
They're not only surviving, but they are building a new man, a new society, a new way of being a human being. In terms of the material survival, there's nobody starving in Cuba now. There were thousands and thousands of peasants before the revolution who ate only when American firms like United Fruit happened to think that they needed some laborers to cut cane. And when they no longer felt that was necessary, the people had no means of subsistence. Now no one starves. Now no one is out of a job. So just on that very basic level of having enough to eat, that problem has been overcome. And then we could go on and talk about all kinds of other things which have happened as a result of the revolution. But
let's talk about some more. Can you talk about some more? I'd like to hear some more about this.
Well, one of the things that a lot of people throw back into your face when you talk about Cuba is they say, well, how come all of those Cubans are coming over to this country every day? And it's true. You know, there's a plane that goes from Cuba to Miami every day, and there are a lot of people who are waiting to come here. But we have to ask ourselves, you know, why are those people coming over here? Why aren't those people satisfied with the revolution? And it's very obvious, because those are the people who had a little bit before the revolution, a little bit, maybe a little bit more than that. But when, after the revolution, the people said to those people who had a house, a mansion maybe, that, you know, maybe there was a little bit too many rooms in there, that they ought to share that with the people, or they ought to move out into a smaller place, and that big place would be taken over as a dormitory for students or as a child care center. You know, they weren't ready to deal with that, because they were concentrating on their own egoistic desires, which had been created and sustained, perpetuated by capitalism. They refused to let go of that mentality. They refused to understand the necessity of collective struggle, of sharing with the people, and therefore they leave. Mm-hmm. Those are the people, you know, who are coming over here today.
You know, you've probably been asked this many, many times before. I'd like to ask you myself, and never had the opportunity to ask you this. Are you against capitalism? I know it sounds like a very naive question.
It was my most mortal enemy. That's the funniest question I ever heard.
Coming back to this country, you know, you made a statement that how can black people be moderate in a violent society or violent situation? Now, you know, every black revolutionist or civil rights worker is asked to be moderate, take a little more time, things like this. How can this be justified with things which may be going against it? Or can it be justified?
I don't think one can. I think, like I said during that speech, you can't ask a mother whose baby is in a fire to snatch that baby out moderately, to snatch that baby out gradually. You know, if I see a friend or a comrade being attacked by the pigs, you know, with machine guns and with dynamite, you can't ask me to go up and be moderate and simply ask the pig to please hold off for a minute until I decide how I'm going to deal with that. You know. And this whole question of nonviolence is something that has really confused the minds of the people in this country. Whenever I contemplate that whole question of nonviolence, I inevitably come up with the conclusion that anybody who accepts nonviolence as a philosophy, as a doctrine, is saying that he embraces a philosophy of suicide. You know, because when in South Africa, all of those thousands and thousands of African men, women, and children went out and prayed against apartheid, and the government, that racist, fascist regime, sent the army out, and thousands of men, women, and children were gunned down, machine gunned in the streets. That should teach us something, and we should learn that nonviolence can only be effective as a tactic when the enemy himself is also nonviolent, when he will listen to moral principles, when he will listen, you know, in a nonviolent manner. But when he meets our nonviolence with tanks and napalm and machine guns, then if we are serious about fighting for the cause that we're talking about, if we're serious about struggling for freedom, it would be immoral of us not to return his blows and to do everything we can to destroy him so that we can talk about winning our struggle for freedom.
You know, you mentioned genocide and birth control. The ratification of a certain treaty, do you remember?
Yeah, in 1948, the UN appointed a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. That convention drew up a treaty which was ratified by the General Assembly then, and which was signed by practically all of the member nations. That treaty is still in existence now. The United States government has not, till this day, signed that treaty. And just that very fact alone ought to teach us that this government has been and continues to follow a policy of genocide. You know, and that genocide is not simply carting people into ovens. That genocide is the brother who, in the streets of the ghetto, is harassed, intimidated, brutalized, murdered for no reason at all. That genocide is the fact that children do not get enough to eat. Children have to go to school without a good breakfast in the morning. Their minds can't function. That genocide is also of a psychological nature. The attempt that has been made, the unsuccessful attempt, I might say, to brainwash black people in this country over the last few centuries. Genocide in Africa. We remember the Congo, and we know what's going on right now. Genocide in Trinidad, genocide all over the world. So I don't think how anybody in his right mind who's thinking today can deny the fact that the United States government is following a policy of genocide in order to sustain the inhuman, murderous, cowardly interests of a minority of the people in this country.
Now, do you feel that black people are the main targets of genocide? Or are there others?
In this country today, black people do constitute the main target. The kind of repression that's coming down on black people is more intensive, more calculated than on any other group of people in the society. And we have to ask ourselves why. Because a lot of people say that it's simply because we're black. Somehow or another, they don't like the color of our skin. But see, that's not true.
I was about to ask you that. Why? You know.
Because there are a lot of people, a lot of black people in this country who don't see themselves, that they happen to be targets of that repression. The reason why is that black people have responded to the attempts to super exploit them, to use them as a reserve labor force in an capitalist economic system, which means that black people are kept unemployed, black people are forced to walk the streets, and black people are forced to expropriate, take what they want. I don't say steal, I say take, liberate what they want in order to survive. The fact that we have not bowed our heads before that fact, the fact that we have continually resisted, continually stood up, continually fought, and they have to resort to those genocidal methods in order to stifle that revolutionary potential, just as they're doing the same thing in Vietnam, because the Vietnamese have not resigned in their struggle in front of all the atomic weapons, the nuclear weapons, the tanks, the napalm, the biological warfare, the chemical warfare, in front of all that whole monstrous apparatus. They have not resigned themselves. They have kept on struggling. Therefore more and more repression comes down.
There are many blacks as well as whites who would take offense to what you've just said. They would say that black people have never lived better in this country. In fact, they would compare black people with somebody overseas and say, see, you're living much better than them. And how do you deal with this kind of thing?
Well, Huey Newton says something that I think is very appropriate and very relevant. He said, when you're in prison, you're in maximum security. When you're let out, or when you're out here, you just put under minimum security. You're in prison just the same. And I don't think it makes any difference whether the prison is a little bit more lax in the methods that it uses. The fact that I have maybe 2 crumbs of bread instead of 1 crumb of bread, that still doesn't mean that I'm free. And we have to keep on, struggling until we get complete and total freedom, until we break down the bars of the prison completely.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of prisons, there is something in which you're involved at the present time. I don't know how many people are aware of the Soledad brothers or not, but one of the young men happens to hail from this city here, which is Pasadena. And our present penal systems, I know what you think about them. I know what I think about them, too. But what part do they play in a possible genocide of black people?
Well, they played a very brutal, murderous role for hundreds and hundreds of years. But what's happening now is that it's becoming more and more obvious that the prisons and all the penal institutions are being used as instruments to perpetuate fascist repression. And I would say that the majority, if not all, of the black men and women who are in the walls of the prisons all across this country today do not belong there. I would say that the so-called crimes which have been used as excuses to bridle all of the rebellion and resistance that black people have exhibited, that we have to begin to understand the nature of crime. We have to begin to understand why black people, why it is that 40% of the 38,000 inmates in the prisons in the state are black. 40%.
In the state of California.
In the state of California. And see, I don't, and most of the brothers and sisters who are in prison have been picked up either for no reason at all or for things like, taking something. They say stealing something. And see, just that act of going out and taking a loaf of bread, taking a stick of butter, in order to ensure the survival of black people, in order to ensure the survival of one's family, I mean, that's an act of resistance, and we have to see it that way. But what's happening is that inside the prisons, more and more black people are realizing that that individual act is not going to change, is not going to destroy the conditions which force us to go out and do that, that we have to get together, we have to talk about collective resistance, collective revolution against the source of our problems. And that's why what's happening is that the prisons are becoming more and more repressive. The Soledad brothers case is very key in understanding what's happening in the prisons, where you have three brothers who are known for their attempts to engage in political organizing within the prison, within Soledad, who were singled out as criminals, who were singled out as having murdered, as having killed a white prison guard, when it's obvious that they had absolutely nothing to do with it. They're using that as an excuse to railroad those brothers to the gas chamber so that the other inmates then see what the penal system has in store for them if they carry on the struggle.
This then is a way of control and genocide too, you might say.
Yeah, and then, Bobby Seale, that's, in this country today, that's the key to an understanding of what the political prisoner is. Again, it's the same thing. Bobby was busted on a trumped-up murder charge, and they're using criminal charges as instruments of political repression, and also to keep the people out here in line. Because see, when you see that if you go out to organize, people, you go out to work, struggle for freedom, that this is what they are going to have in store for you, that you're going to be kidnapped from the streets, they can get you on a conspiracy charge, which means that they have to have practically no evidence whatsoever in order to prove that. And you see they're trying to tell us out here that this is what our fate will be if we continue to struggle. And we aren't listening to that. We say that we're going to fight until we have freed all political prisoners so that we can carry forth the struggle, so that we can destroy an imperialistic, fascist, racist system.
Hard sign here. Angela Davis and I. You've heard Angela Davis and what you might call an opening speech for Angela Davis and friends. Don, you're a writer yourself. I think you're familiar with our prisons, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Well, what do you think of this, from your knowledge of it?
Well, I think the Soledad case represents a continuum of the ugly nature of frame-ups that have happened, particularly to black people, during my lifetime, and I'm 56 years old. I can remember the Scottsboro case, the Trenton Six. I can remember endless cases of blacks who have gone to prison, first on frame-ups, and then after being in prison, having had their sentences escalated to the point where they've taken their lives. And I view the Soledad case as one in this whole series. As a matter of fact, I have a particular interest in this Soledad case because George Jackson, as a bright young black man, went to prison at a time when the whole country was being agitated by young people for civil rights, particularly the heroic young black students in the South. And when he sought to do inside the prison what the young students were doing outside the prison, he became, in the eyes of the prison authorities, a troublemaker and was put on their list to have him isolated and to ultimately do away with him. And based upon this, you see, we find that many of the finest sons of the black community have been sentenced to prison, and certainly those of us who have been observers, at least, of this picture, have to do whatever we can to reverse this, not only in the interests of the black young people who were there, but in the interest of safeguarding whatever remains of democracy in the country.
Angela, getting back to you now, you have a special interest here a special concern, not so much an interest. How do you look at this?
Well, I think that it's very important for every black person in this city and the state to see the necessity to struggle for the release of the Soledad brothers, because what has happened to them could happen to any one of us who are out here talking about fighting for freedom. The three brothers were obviously framed up because of their political activities. I see a lot of people have talked about supporting me at UCLA, supporting my right to teach, that I ought to be able to teach regardless of whatever political opinions or affiliations I might have. And then I say to them, well, if you are for freedom of speech, academic freedom, and all of those notions that people talk about, then you ought to realize that the most important thing you can do now is struggle behind the brothers and sisters who are being denied their right to live because of their political beliefs, their political affiliations, their political activities. And a whole lot of people won't listen to this. A lot of professors who will sit up and say, I won't, although I don't agree with you, I'll defend your right to say what you have to say, and I'll defend your right to go out and organize. When it comes to defending Bobby Seale, when it comes to defending the Soledad brothers, they are silent. And unless people begin to realize that what is happening now is that a repressive apparatus is beginning to set a precedent in terms of new ways of dealing with this revolutionary struggle. And we are beginning to call that legal lynching, using the courts and the prisons as the primary instruments in trying to put down the struggle. Unless they realize that, they're setting themselves up for the very, very same thing. Because if they succeed in sending Bobby to the electric chair and the Soledad brothers to the gas chamber, then that gives them, the right to, move on everybody in that way. But see, we aren't going to allow that to happen. No matter what they do, we're gonna make sure that the Soledad brothers are released, Bobby Seale released.
Now, this new charge against the Soledad brothers happened while in prison, didn't it?
Yeah.
What is the charge they're charged with this time?
Well, they're charged with murder. And see, it's important to realize the facts in the case, because the facts themselves reveal exactly what's going down. The first incident occurred when the inmates of the maximum security row in Soledad prison, who had been kept strictly segregated along racial lines, and anybody who knew anything about Soledad knew that there was a long history of racial conflict, racial tension that was provoked and perpetuated by the prison authorities, so that the brothers did not get together and begin to talk about a united struggle against their oppression. So it seems very strange that, given this history of racial conflict, one day the prison authorities decided to let all of the inmates out onto a recreation yard, a newly built recreation yard, with not one guard with them. Not one guard with them. Anybody who knew anything about that situation knew that some kind of argument, some kind of scuffle would occur, and it did. So what happens? They used this as an excuse then, that is the guard sitting 30 feet above the yard in a gun tower, uses that as an excuse to kill 3 black men who also were known for their political activities in Soledad prison. Now, just because an argument or a scuffle breaks out doesn't mean that you have to use that as an excuse to murder people. They didn't fire a warning shot, there was no alarm, there was no attempt to deal with that situation. And it's important, too, to realize that one of those brothers who was killed had recently told his lawyer that he knew that they were out to get him, and that he probably wouldn't be alive very much longer. So that what happened was, after these 3 men were killed on the recreation yard, the grand jury, in investigating the situation, hands down a verdict of justifiable homicide. And all the black men in Soledad prison knew that their brothers had been murdered, and they were angry. And I think anybody would have been angry who had heard that verdict of justifiable homicide when it was clear that those 3 men, those 3 black men, were shot by this guard without, they were all completely defenseless, no arms, nobody was trying to escape. So that as a result of that verdict, an uproar broke out in the prison. The guard was killed. Nobody knows who killed the guard. He was beaten to death and thrown over the 3rd tier. They kept all of the men involved in both incidents. This was in a completely different section of the prison, by the way, where the white prison guard was killed. And that eventually what they did was they pointed to George, John, and Fleta, single them out. They were also doing the same kind of political work that those other 3 brothers were. And the inmates inside the prison knew exactly what was going on. What is, I think, evidence of the kind of work that they had been doing is the fact that those brothers have raised $700 within the prison for the defense of the Soledad brothers. And you know how much it takes to raise $700 in a prison where you don't get 3 cents to 10 cents an hour for working. So I think that it should be obvious to anyone who just looks at the facts that they're attempting to politically persecute the first was political assassination, and now they're going to try to use the courts to politically assassinate the 3 Soledad brothers.
When you speak of politics going on inside of a prison, what kind of politics are we possibly talking about here? Is it racial politics? What?
Well, see, one of the things that the brothers have been trying to do was to break down all of that racial conflict that's perpetuated by the prison authorities. And we've gotten messages from some of the inmates in Soledad, and they say that the guards very often will give a white inmate a weapon, a zip gun, a knife, or something like that. Tell him to start something with a black inmate and use that as an excuse to get that black inmate and put him in the hole, beat him up, kill him. There are other incidents where brothers have been killed at Soledad that just haven't happened to come to the eye of the public. And one of the things that George did, for which he spent 2.5 years in solitary in the hole, is that he tried to protest the segregated conditions in the television room. And so I think all of these things point to the fact that what they're doing in the prisons is they're trying to create disunity. They allow the white inmates to organize their right-wing, fascist organizations, which are stimulated directly by the prison authorities, and they use them against the black prisoners. One of the things they're doing now is that they let these white fascists come up and intimidate and harass the 3 brothers. They're in these cells alone, and they allow them to march by, throw things into the cell, call them all kinds of names, and just attempt to reduce them to beings less than human.
What you're saying here, the prisons are segregated by race, right? The black inmates are in some cells and whites in others. That's correct?
This is what the prison authorities have done. They want to use every means they can to repress and oppress, the prisoners.
Could I add a point,
Go right ahead,
if I may? Because I think the time factor is very important, and which helps points up the significance of the Soledad case. See, during the 60s, when blacks were demonstrating, marching, protesting, they were able to make some dent on some of the institutions in society. Some minor breakthroughs were accomplished. Well, one of the institutions in society that never was touched by this were the prison institutions. Meanwhile, you had this massive increase of the prison population from among blacks and Chicanos and other minority groups. However, there were no corresponding alterations made in the supervision of these prisons. The personnel who tend to rule and to shape the policies of these prisons remain all white, and at the same time, with this new influx from minority groups who in some instances carried with them the whole spirit of change that was taking place outside, they sought to repress by terror, by intimidation, and by actual murder. And I think that it's in this context we have to see the special significance of the Soledad case.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I think it's important to point out when we try to understand what's going on in the prisons. Look, George Jackson was busted for a second-degree robbery, and it doesn't even matter that he didn't even commit that robbery. Second-degree robbery, and usually you get about 2 years for that. I think it was for taking a very, very small amount of money from a gas station that somebody else he knew did. Now look at all of these white executives who embezzle millions of dollars. And what do they get? What do they get? A suspended sentence usually. They get out on, they get, when you talk about bail, they get out on their own signature. Is that our brothers who are being busted for these robbery charges, they are not criminals. They are not criminals. Most of the time, they are doing nothing more than trying to satisfy basic human needs, because we have been prevented rather from satisfying those needs in the normal channels, so that we have to take it upon ourselves to liberate what we need in order to survive. So we have to stop calling our brothers and sisters who are in the prisons today criminals. What they are is that they are rebels against an oppressive, repressive, fascist society. There are, in this country, there is rather a small minority of men who have been acting against humanity, who have been killing, murdering, exploiting, oppressing those men, those capitalists who are able to generate profit, monetary profit every day by forcing the majority, the masses of this people in this country to use their labor to create products, the benefits of which then go to the ones who don't do anything at all. And see, those are the people who are the criminals in this society. We call those people the criminals, and we say that we are going to seize power and we are going to mete out to them the punishment which they deserve. And that punishment, if given the nature of their crime, is a punishment that is now inconceivable. But we are going to talk about, seizing power and giving them the punishment that they deserve. And after the revolution, we'll probably still have some, jails and prisons, but the right people are going to be in those jails and prisons. Everybody who has been to one of the hearings in that Selena's courtroom can see written all over the face of George Jackson and John Boucher and Frida Drungo a will and determination to keep on struggling, to keep on fighting. If you want to talk about George's attitude and his ability to fight, his ability to struggle, it's much stronger, much greater than the majority of the people who are out here in that minimum security. And they keep those brothers chained. They have chains around their waist, under their crotch. Their wrists are chained to their waist, and they have shackles on their feet whenever they're out of their cells. And given that fact, We ought to see that, the fact that those brothers are continuing to stand up. Still, in those chains, they refuse to bow their heads. They hold their heads up high. And every time they come into the courtroom, even though they can't get their wrists, their hands up very high, they give us the power sign and say, all power to the people. So that ought to tell us something. That ought to tell us that if brothers can keep on fighting under those kinds of oppressive conditions, and we know that they're fighting for us. And so we see them as heroes. We see them as our warriors who have been ripped off from us and who have been incarcerated in order to stifle our struggle. We had better start standing up just as much as they can and fighting for their freedom, because the fight for their freedom is to fight for our own freedom.
Concern do black people have for black prisoners in general? Is there any real concern, unless he's related or a friend or something like this?
Well, see, one of the things is that when black people hear about what's happening in Soledad prison, when they hear about what's happening to Bobby Seale, black people understand, because in this city, there are very few black families who have not had an immediate confrontation with those pigs, and they understand what's going on. The problem is that the power structure uses every means in their power to prevent us from getting together. They have refused consistently to say anything about the Soledad brothers, in spite of all the work that has been done. They have attempted to portray the Black Panther Party as a group of criminals and thugs, and they have attempted to distort the minds of the people. They have not succeeded. The fact that they have not succeeded is exhibited by the reaction in the black community all over this country to the conspiracy against the Black Panther Party. When we are able to reach black people and tell them about what's happening in Soledad prison, they say, right on, we want to do everything we can, because we know that what's happening to George and what's happening to John and what's happening to Fleeta, what's happening to Bobby, what has happened to Huey, and we can go all the way down the line. We know that we will be the eventual targets of that same kind of repression. So black people understand. It's just up to those people in this country, those black people who have been able to acquire the knowledge about how we go about destroying this, to communicate that to our people, to get out and create a united struggle. And they're going to do everything. When I say they, I'm talking about the fascists. They're going to do everything they can to prevent us, but we're going to keep on struggling.
Let me give
something that's very important to point out, I think, is that they are really afraid. That's why you haven't heard anything about the Soledad brothers, because they are afraid that when people's eyes get focused on the Soledad brothers, they're going to focus in on these medieval prison structures, and people are going to wake up and they're going to start fighting. There has been, it appears, a conspiracy among the capitalist press to keep every single word concerning the Soledad brothers out of the news. And I can be a witness to that, because every time somebody has interviewed me about my case at UCLA, I have always mentioned the Soledad brothers case. In each instance that was eliminated, but I have not heard anybody say that they saw anything in the newspaper or on television about the Soledad brothers, and I have consistently pointed to that as one of the key things that we have to struggle around. So we have to start talking about counteracting those forces. And we're getting the news out to the people in spite of them, so that the people will begin to see the necessity of tearing down this whole obsolete structure that's oppressing us.